This is a photograph of the Citadel in Halifax, Nova Scotia. It was taken using a camera set up in a tethered balloon operated by a captain in the British Royal Engineers in 1883, at a time when Imperial troops were still garrisoned in Canada. It records the view from what is probably our very first military flight. But it wasn't until well into the new century that the government began to think seriously about military aviation. This was because so many inventors and fledgling aircraft manufacturers were constantly pestering them with their ideas and pitches and spiels. In 1907, the visionary inventor Alexander Graham Bell formed the Aerial Experiment Association. These were the two Canadian members of his team, Casey Baldwin and J.A.D. McCurdy. Using Bell's summer home near the hamlet of Bedeque in Nova Scotia as a base, McCurdy made the first Canadian airplane flight in the Silver Dart on the 23rd of February, 1909.
This may seem to be a small matter at present, but when flying machines have become common and aerial locomotion a well-organized and established mode of transit, the origin of the art in Canada will become a matter of great historical interest.
By 1909, we had our first formal aviation policy. The Department of Militia and Defense would support experiments in aerial navigation by providing men and equipment, but regretfully, no financial assistance could be given. Baldwin and McCurdy were invited up to Petawawa for the summer to conduct trials with their two flying machines, as long as they didn't interfere with the artillery ranges. Militia headquarters approved the expenditure of $5 for materials to build a primitive shelter for the aircraft. The flights were not an unqualified success. In front of high-ranking observers, the Silver Dart lifted into the air 3 times, just the latest in over 300 flights. But it crashed on the 4th, never to fly again. Now it was the turn of Bedeque 1. The aircraft was rolled out at dawn the next day for its second flight. With McCurdy at the controls, it took off and flew fine for 100 yards or so, but suddenly it nosed up, stalled, and crashed. That was it for the Bedeque 1. Undaunted, the two flyers returned to Nova Scotia, where they continued development on the imaginatively named Bedeque 2. By November of the year 09, they had made more than 50 flights in it. In March of the following year, when Brador Lake was still frozen, the militia department sent a Major G.S. Monsell to observe the goings-on and report on progress. In fact, McCurdy took Monsell as a passenger on 2 of them, and thus the Major became the first Canadian officer to fly in a heavier-than-air machine while on duty, the first of many. He subsequently tried to persuade the government to support the two flyers financially so that they could continue their experiments, but he was unsuccessful. In 1910, Baldwin and McCurdy closed down their operations for good. But Monsell was tenacious. By 1912, promoted lieutenant colonel, he wrote,
"It is not particularly important what design of aeroplane is chosen as a first step, as all the present designs will be obsolete within a few years. But the point is to make a start."
The chief of the General Staff, Major General G.J. Mackenzie, concurred. However, Mackenzie ran into a very large roadblock in the form of the eccentric Colonel Sam Hughes, by now in 1912, the Minister of Militia and Defense. Hughes was not at all keen on aviation and quashed any thought of appropriating funds for either training or equipment in the next year's budget estimates.
"Airplanes are costly toys, only as yet in the experimental stage."
They weren't air-minded, and you can't expect them to have been air-minded when people are still riding horses in the military. In fact, there was a remarkable degree of foresight, the Chief of General Staff at the time, in considering aircraft for reconnaissance purposes. And they gave it a fairly fair test at Petawawa, but The poor old Bedeck 1 and 2 didn't do very well on either of their trials. They all ended up crashing after 1 or 2 flights, and this was hardly a cost-effective means of carrying out military reconnaissance. Even during the war, they said what you really need to do is get in a horse on a high spot and have a look.
As a result of pre-war neglect, Canadian flyers did not serve as members of a Canadian expeditionary force led by its own officers and supported by the people at home. Instead, they fought and died as part of multinational British-led imperial forces. In the early days of the war, of course, all this national uncertainty was still in the future. With typical impetuosity, Sam Hughes seemed single-handedly to create a homegrown flying corps. In early September 1914, the first contingent of the Canadian Expeditionary Force were marshalling at Valcartier, preparing to go overseas. Hughes showed up to supervise the arrangements. He encountered 2 aviation enthusiasts and commissioned them on the spot.
Mr. E.L. Janney is appointed provisional commander of the Canadian Aviation Corps with the rank of captain and is authorized to purchase 1 biplane with necessary accessories, entailing an expenditure of not more than $5,000.
Janney immediately went to the Marblehead, Massachusetts plant of the Burgess Company and bought a Burgess Dunn No. 1. It was put on board a ship and taken to England along with the first contingent. The Canadian Aviation Corps, with its total establishment of 3, set itself up on Salisbury Plain along with the Canadian headquarters. But very soon the CAC was disbanded. Janney and his mechanic were discharged and sent home. Sharp asked for and got a transfer to the Royal Flying Corps. He crashed and was killed on his first solo flight.
It was heavily influenced by the mercurial nature of Sam Hughes, who was Minister of Militia at the time, and he listened to this young man by the name of Janney and his colleague Sharp, and decided we had to have an aviation corps. Consequently, we had a Burgess Dunn fly up from the States, crash, or not, force land in the St. Lawrence River, and eventually get itself across to England by transport, and ultimately come to a sticky end at Camp Aldershot, and that was the end of the Aviation Corps until, of a Canadian Aviation Corps until 1918.
By early 1916, the development of aviation was so rapid and its growing importance to the war effort so obvious that an official policy based on refusing to have anything whatsoever to do with an air force could no longer be sustained. As Royal Flying Corps losses mounted, especially after the heavy casualties sustained during the First Battle of the Somme, Britain became more interested in recruiting flyers from Canada, not only for the RFC, but also for the Royal Naval Air Service. After a couple of false starts, a training scheme was set up in Canada. The privately run Curtis School in Toronto taught hundreds of Canadians to fly in aircraft such as JN-3 biplanes. But the main training impetus came just before Christmas 1916, when it was announced that a large British training organization was to be established in Canada. This would become the RFC Canada, later the RAF Canada scheme.
There was potential here, both for recruiting airmen and for training. Canada had good conditions. It was far away from any enemy. It demonstrated how valuable Canada was to any, at that time, imperial military aviation effort.
Canadians, under British instructors, were to be trained for the air war and the air age to come, not just in the hundreds, but in the thousands. In December 1916, Canadian Aeroplanes Limited was established under the control of the Imperial Munitions Board. The idea was to buy aircraft manufactured in Canada rather than the States. The new company quickly began turning out JN-4s, a refined version of the Curtiss JN-3, a 2-seater trainer better known as the Jenny. The job of setting up RFC Canada, or the Imperial Royal Flying Corps as it was styled in advertisements, fell to Lieutenant Colonel Cuthbert Hoare. This extremely able officer selected and established Camp Borden, later to become the senior air station of the Royal Canadian Air Force, within 4 months of his arrival in Canada. 1,700 men worked day and night on the construction. Although work progressed very rapidly, everything was done well. Of the 15 hangars that were built, many of them are still in use. The Borden Aerodrome became the template for other RFC flying fields in Canada.
Hoare, thanks to his rather freewheeling initiatives, was able to set the precedent really for the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan in the Second World War. But the first significance was that this provided a wonderful source of aircrew for Royal Flying Corps, Royal Naval Air Service, and it increased the numbers of Canadians in those services by a very appreciable amount.
In these early days, it must be said that flying discipline was somewhat lax compared to modern times. Flying cadets were encouraged to show dash, after all. Perhaps not surprisingly, 129 cadets were killed in flying accidents during training with RFC Canada. That is, 1 for every 1,900 hours in the air. But that was still much better, almost 3 times better, than all of the other RFC training establishments in the British Empire. Of the 9,000 cadets enlisted in the RFC Canada training scheme, more than a third completed their flying training, and 2,500 were sent overseas, albeit as many as a third of them were American nationals eager to enter the fray. It's fair to say that their exposure to flying in this way nurtured the role of aviation in Canada in the post-war years to come. By late 1917, the first of the newly trained Canadian flyers were reaching England. From this point on, Canadian aircrew entered flying operations in steadily increasing numbers. In the Royal Naval Air Service, Canadian aircrew served in all of the fighter squadrons at Dunkirk, their large continental base. They went into action against German Zeppelins, seaplanes, and U-boats from bases on the east and south coasts of England, such as Felixstowe and Portland. And they helped to pioneer long-range strategic bombing. They flew a range of aircraft, such as Sopwith 1.5 strutters, Camels and Pups, Short Brothers seaplanes, and flying boats such as this Curtiss H-12 Large America. Of 500,000 tons of British shipping which sailed in the last 2 weeks of April, 400,000 tons were sunk by either mines or submarines, mostly within 200 miles of the coast. This was a level of loss which simply could not be sustained. To counter these attacks, seaplanes, flying boats, aeroplanes of the RNAS, and non-rigid airships flew almost 4,000 patrols between the summer and December 1917. During 7,500 hours of flying time, 86 German submarines were spotted and attacks pressed home on 58 of them. It's estimated that more than 200 Canadian airmen were involved in these operations.
Only one submarine, so far as I know, was sunk by the Royal Naval Air Service aircraft or RAF aircraft during the First World War. And it was sunk by a flying boat flown by 2 Canadians in the Channel. The really important thing was to keep submarines from surfacing in the vicinity of shipping. And they succeeded in this beyond all imagination. With air escort and convoys, they reduced the sinking rate to practically nothing.
In the history of air power, there is perhaps nothing as controversial as strategic bombing.
In the First World War, long-range bombing on targets of great strategic importance were thought to be things that would have a very strong impact on the outcome of operations in the war. it was almost inevitable that the High Command of the Air Force would push for strategic bombing.
It was the RNAS that pioneered long-range bombing on the Imperial side. The Royal Navy, after all, viewed the strategic potential of this new weapon almost automatically, being well used to operational deployments all over the world. But this wouldn't last for long.
The disbanding of the RNAS came as a result of political differences, inter-service rivalries, different philosophies about the way in which aircraft should be used and aircraft should be procured. And eventually it was, you could say, a victory of the War Office over the Admiralty.
By no means everyone agreed, either on the new force or the new role. One of the strongest opponents to strategic bombing was Field Marshal Douglas Haig, the commander of the British armies in France.
In my opinion, our military policy in aerial respects must be based on the principle that a successful end of the war can be brought about only by decisive victory over the enemy's forces in the field. I have no reason to suppose that the bombing of German towns, merely for the purpose of terrorizing the civil population, is a method of warfare which would be approved by His Majesty's government, nor would I recommend its adoption.
And General Hugh Trenchard, Haig's commander of the Royal Flying Corps, thought that the push for the creation of a unified air force was part and parcel of the bigger push for a bombing campaign against Germany herself. This had been prompted by a public demand for reprisals in response to German raids, one of which over London had killed 66 school children on the 13th of June in 1917. Trenchard also maintained that the whole argument was based on the notion that the war could be won in the air as opposed to on the ground. The mainly Canadian 3 wing of the RNAS, based at Luxeuil in northern France, was the first assigned to bombing operations deep into Germany. And Canadians served in significant numbers during the RAF's bombing offensives of 1918, maintaining and flying aircraft such as the Handley Page 0400 and the de Havilland DH-9. The strategic bombing campaign was launched from a number of bases around the town of Nancy. It lasted for more than a year, during which time more than 500 raids were carried out. Typical of the bombing crew's experience is that of 104 Squadron's dawn raid on the 22nd of August. 13 DH-9s took off to bomb the BASF chemical works at Mannheim. Crossing the German lines, one aircraft was immediately shot down by anti-aircraft fire. 8 enemy scouts appeared and stood off, waiting to pounce on stragglers. In a little under 4 hours, the squadron lost 7 out of 12 machines. It was a scene repeated throughout the year. Total losses to the independent bombing force amounted to 458 aircraft. A British commission went to Germany shortly after the armistice on an inspection tour. After all the thousands of bombs and incendiaries that were dropped, they had expected to discover scenes of devastation.
It is very noteworthy how surprisingly little serious damage has been done throughout 4 years of war, and on no occasion has a factory been forced to close down for more than a week as a direct result of bombing. It did not affect the output of the factories in any way.
Canadian flyers began to appear in significant numbers toward the end of 1915. By 1917-18, when the war in the air reached its peak, the numbers and skills of Canadian air and ground crews were important elements in the RFC's successes. This is the Zeppelin Raider L-48. It fell to the guns of Torontonian Lieutenant Loudon Watkins of 37 Squadron on the 17th of June, 1917. It was her very first bombing raid over England. And this is L-70, the first of an enormous new type of Zeppelin. The huge airship was destroyed by Major Egbert Cadbury and Captain Robert Leckie on the night of the 5th of August, 1918. Of the 12 Zeppelins shot down by British aircraft in the course of the war, 6 were accounted for by Canadians, either individually or as part of a team. Aerial fighting was a special skill in which several Canadians won widely acknowledged distinction. Men such as Bishop, Collishaw, Barker, and McLaren became household heroes in Canada and Britain. In fact, Billy Bishop from Owen Sound, Ontario, became the leading British ace of the war, being credited with 72 kills. And of course, he won Canada's first Victoria Cross in the air, which was also notable because it was awarded on the strength of his word alone, there being no witnesses to his dawn raid on the enemy airfield at Estormel. Major Ray Collishaw of Nanaimo, BC, led the famous Black Flight of Naval 10, the RNAS squadron, in his Sopwith triplane. He was credited with 60 victories. Manfred Freiherr von Richthofen, the Red Baron, was credited with 80 victories of his own. The Fokker triplanes of his so-called Flying Circus, Jagdgeschwader 1, were distinguished by their exuberant paint schemes and markings. Richthofen was flying a solid red plane when he was shot down and killed on the 21st of April 1918. Captain Roy Brown of Carleton Place near Ottawa was credited with this action. The third Air VC was won by Second Lieutenant A.A. McLeod of Stonewall, Manitoba. In March 1918, the Germans mounted a furious offensive that smashed through the Allied front. McLeod was aloft at the controls of his two-seater reconnaissance aircraft when he and his observer were jumped by 8 Fokker triplanes. Soon, his aircraft was on fire. It seems fantastic, but when the heat from the flames became too intense, McLeod climbed out on the wing and piloted the plane from there. Despite being wounded 5 times, he made a successful forced landing in no man's land. He was hit for the 6th time as he carried his even more badly wounded observer to safety. Aerial fighting was by no means confined to the Western Front. Led by Major Billy Barker, VC, 14 Canadian fighter pilots based beside the Piave River in Italy together accounted for some 130 enemy aircraft destroyed. He won his VC in October of 1918 when, though wounded 3 times, he shot down 4 German aircraft before crash landing his Sopwith Snipe behind the British lines near Valenciennes. At its best, air operations in the First World War welded infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft into a close-knit combat team.
Most aircraft were used in the very pedestrian kind of flying of reconnaissance, artillery spotting, and cooperation with ground troops. And by 1918, there were 2 very important roles for aircraft in the ground war. One was supporting ground troops in the trenches by actually low flying and strafing enemy formations. And the second thing was what they called counter anti-tank operations. You had aircraft destroying enemy anti-tank guns, which enabled our tanks to advance.
Early in the last year of the war, Canada finally accepted Britain's invitation to organize a wing of their own within the RAF. It was intended to form 1 Canadian fighter squadron and 1 of bombers.
What was wanted in Canada was the development of aviation for domestic purposes, and a Canadian Air Force was tied to the formation of a Canadian Air Board. And what they did form was a Canadian Air Force in Canada that replaced the Canadian Air Force overseas, using the gift of aircraft from the Royal Air Force, large numbers of aircraft from the Royal Air Force, and some of the aircraft from the Royal Canadian Naval Air Service, the HS-12 flying boats that the United States Navy gave to Canada after the war. And these resulted in the creation of an Air Force that was designed to support both civil and military purposes.
Born just a few days after the armistice on the 11th of November, 1918, the Canadian Air Force was fated to have a precarious, unsettled, and temporary existence. The idea was to form the CAF around a corps of about 50 very experienced officers, many of them highly decorated, and a few hundred well-trained ground crew, and equipped at no cost with up to 100 former RAF aircraft given as a gift to Canada. The whole force was to be shipped back to Canada, lock, stock, and barrel. But this was not to be. The political mood at home had changed. No one in the government wanted to spend even modest amounts of money on an air force. The CAF was formally disbanded in February 1920. Many of the airmen stayed in England and took up commissions offered to them in the RAF. Others were demobilized and came back to Canada. The result was a frittering away of valuable manpower, training, and equipment resources, which had cost millions to consolidate and would cost millions to recreate at a later date. A similar fate awaited the 1st Royal Canadian Naval Air Service, which had become operational on the 5th of September 1918. It was temporarily disbanded for more than a quarter century, not reforming until 1946. These were the cream of as many as 13,000 Canadian combat flyers who flew in the air services, along with many thousands more maintainers.
One of the great gifts of the First World War was this enormous basis of airmen who had been trained and who were good pilots. Not all of them stayed in the business, but enough did that you had the nucleus on which to build. The CAF was an attempt to develop a Canadian Air Force in line with what had been developed in the way of military aviation during the First World War. The best way in which to build up air power, if you're going to use air power, is not simply to build a military aviation corps. You need to build up the infrastructure on which aviation works. So you had to have the industry, you had to have the equipment, you had to have the training and the men. Well, you had elements of all that from the First World War.
In its early years, the CAF concentrated on pioneering aviation in an array of civilian-oriented tasks: forest patrols and fighting fires, aerial mapping, surveying and photography, medical rescue flights, and ice patrols. In addition, the CAF was responsible for overseeing the development of the entire field of Canadian aviation, everything from registering civil aircraft, supervising aircraft design and construction, and helping to create a national network of interconnected airfields along the populated southern latitudes of the country. Very little was done in the way of military flight training, although in May of 1923, the first course of provisional pilot officers began at Camp Borden. They were the first new pilots to be trained in Canada since the end of the war. It did, however, maintain something of its military identity. From the beginning, the force granted its own commissions, wore its own light blue uniforms, and used RAF ranks, ensign, and motto. In early 1923, the Royal Sobriquet was applied for and granted. And on the 1st of April, 1924, King's Regulations and Orders for the RCAF came into effect. Its permanent force component had an establishment of 66 officers and 194 airmen. As far as the general public was concerned, it was suspicious of flying and particularly amazed by aerobatics. With the delivery in 1927 and 28 of 8 Armstrong Whitworth Siskins, the possibility of creating an RCAF formation flying team was raised by headquarters and taken up enthusiastically by the pilots and crews at Camp Borden. In 1931, the Siskins were the high point of a Trans-Canada air pageant and flew some 35 shows at airfields right across the country. Canada, indeed North America, could no longer assume immunity from attack from the air simply because of the transoceanic distances separating the continents. And naval forces on their own could not possibly ensure protection because of the speed and surprise with which air raids could be mounted.
The Chief of General Staff, General MacNaughton at the time, was very conscious of the importance of the air weapon in carrying out Canadian defense policy, that the only way you could respond quickly to a threat on either of our coasts was by air.
Major General A.G.L. MacNaughton became a champion of air power and soon launched a set of new planning initiatives. By the summer of 1932, a staff officer at Air Force Headquarters had completed a draft plan. The primary role of the new military-oriented RCAF was to be home, essentially coastal defense. A secondary role would be participation in an expeditionary force for service overseas. But the need for new equipment was becoming acute. Between 1930 and 1935, the RCAF wrote off 143 aircraft because of crashes or because their age made them unsafe to fly. In 1936, the Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, wrote,
"As a Canadian citizen, I owe it to our country to protect it in a mad world, both on sea and in the air. But we owe it to ourselves and subsequent generations to lay foundations on which they will have to build."
Later that year, the RCAF's share of the federal budget was tripled, although it was still woefully inadequate for anything more than basic equipment and some operational training. Nevertheless, by early in 1937, after a somewhat desultory debate in Parliament, the RCAF was formally given primary responsibility for the direct defense of the country.
I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine.
The Munich crisis of September 1938 concentrated military planners' minds wonderfully, and the inadequacy of Canada's air defenses became all too apparent. It was quickly realized that the RCAF had to be transformed, and fast, into an efficient and modern military organization. Available resources were hardly up to the task. The 150 officers and fewer than 1,000 airmen, with an additional 600 in the reserve, and 39 obsolete military aircraft, of which only 12 could carry effective bomb loads, would scarcely have presented a credible deterrent, even to the most faint-hearted enemy. It was, to put it bluntly, in a dreadful state. None of the RCAF's 11 permanent force squadrons, let alone its 12 auxiliary ones, were sufficiently manned, equipped, or free from civil aviation tasks to be able to concentrate on a training program for its wartime establishment. The immediate priority of the CAS, Air Commodore G.M. Croyle, was to equip his 9 permanent squadrons assigned to coastal defense at least with modern aircraft. The first 5 of an eventual 40 Supermarine Stranraer flying boats had been ordered from Canadian Vickers in 1936. This relatively modern aircraft was designed to fulfill the long-range coastal reconnaissance role. It carried a crew of 6 and had a range of about 1,000 miles. 2 of them were hurried into service with 5 Squadron in late 1938. Croyle ordered another 7 of those right away, along with 18 Westland Wapitis, 13 Blackburn Sharks, and a number of Bristol Bolingbrooks and Westland Lysanders. Canadian conditions required a twin-engine 2-seater with sufficient range and endurance to enable it to overfly vast undeveloped territory with some degree of safety, and later long-range maritime patrol aircraft. Nevertheless, in June of 1939, RCAF pilots showed up on the Vancouver docks and took delivery of 10 brand new Hawker Hurricane monoplane fighters. Apart from the problem of purchasing modern aircraft in sufficient numbers, the Air Force had to think about establishing air stations, support services, and communications over vast distances and sometimes rugged terrain. Air Force General Order No. 2 in 1938 decentralized command and control and established Western Air Command at Vancouver, Eastern Air Command at Halifax, and Air Training Command at Toronto.
When rearmament began, the government of the day recognized that it was necessary to build up our air strength, perhaps more than any other aspect of the rearmament process. The recognition was there that we would have to expand quickly. When in 1939 war was declared, we managed to get some aircraft from the United States anyway, before the United States neutrality laws prevented any further export of military material from the United States to Canada.
In early September 1939, the world held its breath and waited for war. No. 1 Squadron's Hurricanes arrived in Halifax, and the ancient Wapitis of No. 3 staggered in. The only fully operational airbase on Canada's east coast was Dartmouth Seaplane Station, and the only really operational unit was No. 5 Squadron, with its handful of Stranraer flying boats. By the 4th of September, the whole Air Force, including auxiliary squadrons and reserves, was placed on active service. Total strength barely topped 4,000. We had 53 serviceable aircraft, most of them already obsolete or converted from civil use. Within a few days of Canada's declaration of war on the German Reich, the Chiefs of Staff of the three armed services submitted to the Minister of National Defense recommendations for military operations in the event that a general conflict involving the United Kingdom broke out. The Navy and the Army chiefs urged direct support and reinforcement of British forces. But Air Vice Marshal Croyle, the Chief of the Air Staff, was more concerned with the defense of Canada. He wanted to form 23 squadrons, 17 of which would remain in Canada. The other 6, he suggested, would support an expeditionary force.
I don't think Croyle was against overseas involvement. In fact, you see his mind changing several times in the first few weeks of the war. And when he finally comes down one side or the other, it's on the side of having an overseas expansion.
But all this was soon pushed to the background. It quickly emerged that the RCAF's main function, at least initially, should be the setting up of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. Created in December 1939 after rather tortured negotiations between British and Canadian representatives, the BCATP was a truly massive undertaking.
Canada, even then, was interested in the bottom line. Once the plan had started, the problem was, could the Canadian Air Force, in its embryo state, run such a huge organization? And indeed, it proved quite a task. And for the first 2 years, a lot of help had to be obtained from the Royal Air Force until 1942, when the first part of the agreement was over. They had a conference and changed the circumstances so that Canada virtually took over the entire plan. Instead of having British bases in Canada training people as well as Canadian, they became all Canadian after 1942. Not only was Canada an ideal place for it, close to Britain from terms of across the Atlantic Ocean, rather than being as far away as Australia, where some of the training was taking place, southern Rhodesia, where some of the training was taking place, and also, of course, close to the United States, where they could get industrial support for what they were doing.
The frost was barely out of the ground in early 1940 when construction crews moved onto the new sites on the prairies and in the sparsely populated regions of Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes to carve out the runways and erect the hangars. 3,500 training aircraft were required right away. All the planes Britain could spare were shipped over, and an assortment of other types were acquired one way or the other. Soon, trainees were taking first flights in planes like this de Havilland Tiger Moth, and going on to more advanced single and multi-engine machines. At the same time, middle-aged bush pilots were taxiing non-flying aircrew around the prairie skies as they learned to shoot or take star sights or make crackly contact with their towers. In the spring of 1943, the Flying Control Branch was established in the RCAF. Prior to this, air traffic control wasn't considered as a distinct profession. ATC assistants were from general duty trades, and a pilot was always in the tower to keep an eye on things during flight operations. 31 BC ATP flying units were in operation by the end of 1940, a truly fantastic achievement. The first pilot class graduated in September of that year at Camp Borden. The first observers graduated at Trenton in October, along with the first air gunners, navigators, and wireless operators from other camps. At its peak, in 1943, nearly 100 flight training schools had been set up across the country. BC ATP staff exceeded 100,000, a ratio of 15 support personnel for every one pilot trainee. In the year before war broke out, the RCAF had trained a total of 45 pilots. By war's end, over 130,000 aircrew had passed through the system, 73,000 of them Canadian. The remainder consisted of British, Australians, New Zealanders, and those who had escaped from their homelands before the Nazi occupations. Of all the Commonwealth aircrew trained during the Second World War, 45% of them flew first in Canada.
Without a training scheme of this kind, it would have been very difficult to continually provide aircrew for the very heavy demands of the operational theaters, especially in light of the heavy casualties we suffered. The BCATP made, in terms of numbers, an enormous contribution to achieving air superiority. The training of Canadians got better as time went along, their efficiency got better, whereas the enemy was suffering very heavy casualties himself, and consequently new aircrew were coming into operations with less training, they were less efficient, and you had the double effect of numbers and quality versus declining numbers and declining quality on the enemy side.
The RCAF Women's Division was formed in July of 1941, initially as the Canadian Women's Auxiliary Air Force. Its purpose was to train women to take over a number of varied tasks from office support to aircraft maintenance, so that men may fly, as the recruiting posters put it. Many women did serve overseas, at RCAF headquarters in London, and on stations within No. 6 RCAF Bomber Group in the north of England. The air defense of Canada should have been dealt with fairly easily. After all, the threat from the air was not significant. The main danger lay in surface radar and U-boat attacks on shipping off the East Coast. The fall of France and the impending Battle of Britain concentrated our strategists' minds, and material assistance was sent to Britain with all dispatch. This was the right decision. Had Britain fallen, North America would have had a big problem.
The main concern at the beginning of the war was that if we didn't have some kind of defense on the West Coast, the Americans would take it over for us. And there goes your sovereignty. So Mackenzie King in particular was very worried when President Roosevelt would say, we're good neighbors and we'll make sure nothing happens to you. Well, he wanted to make sure that the Americans wouldn't become too evident there. And there was that constant worry throughout the war of American domination, of Canadian presence. So when the threat becomes very clear after Pearl Harbor in 1941, the agreement with the United States allowed for the Americans taking over unified command in case of a direct threat, direct strategic threat. But only in that case. Otherwise, the Canadians should remain in command. Well, the Canadians successfully argued that there was no direct threat on the West Coast.
Paradoxically, Canada ended up with too many of the wrong resources. Our home defense fighter squadrons grew far too large. We created a home defense air force that was top-heavy with non-frontline fighters, such as these Kitty Hawks. There was no useful operational work for these aircraft, even for part of the time.
Our chiefs of staff shared the opinion of the British chiefs of staff that the Japanese would be far too concerned in Southeast Asia, putting all their resources there to be able to do much more than conduct raids against the west coast of North America.
In 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic began in earnest, and the RCAF focused on patrolling the shipping lanes to Halifax and Newfoundland. The very active East Coast Theater of Operations suffered from a shortage of both aircrew and materiel in its vital anti-submarine role, especially as the Battle of the Atlantic reached its crisis in the spring of '43, and the Allies were striving to close the mid-Atlantic gap. Once again, Eastern Air Command's efforts in these types of operations were only partly successful, and their results did not match up to those achieved by Canadians flying with RAF Coastal Command, which they sought to emulate, at that time, the most successful maritime air force in the world. But up until the last 2 years of the war, Canadians had to fly underpowered, ill-equipped machines through some of the world's worst flying weather, trying to provide air cover to Allied shipping and protect it against submarine attack on the western side of the Atlantic.
You had 5 squadrons flying out of Halifax, Stranraer, and they had very little direct contact with the Navy, except that they knew they were supposed to be flying escort over convoys, and this they did, quite competently, but there was no submarine threat in that part of the world at that time. When the submarine threat started appearing, then you started to have problems because the Air Force and the Navy remained relatively independent. The Air Force sent its detachments and its squadrons to Newfoundland and to the Maritimes. The Navy set up its base in St. John's, and they did have joint operational control rooms, but not until mid-1943, after an Allied anti-submarine survey board had been to Canada and made some severe criticisms of the Canadian system, did they begin to work properly together.
Aircrew in Eastern Air Command managed to achieve a great deal in spite of these obstacles. They went from lumbering up and down the Nova Scotia coast in planes like these Douglas Digby's in 1939, to striking directly at the enemy in mid-Atlantic just 4 years later, using the latest equipment in up-to-date aircraft. When the U-boats adopted submerged tactics after the fall of '43, they were once again able to avoid attack from the air. To counter this, Canadian-based maritime patrol squadrons got the famous Lee lights as well as centimetric radar technology for their very long-range Liberators. However, the U-boats knew they were there, and the success of our East Coast-based patrols must be measured in terms of shipping that was not sunk, as opposed to U-boats that were. This part of the RCAF's operational history cannot be concluded without mention of what's known as the ultra-secret, and the intelligence about U-boat operations which was delivered well in advance from cracking the secret German Enigma codes. Despite this fantastic source of information, the lack of combined operations between the Navy and the Air Force on the East Coast meant that opportunities were almost certainly lost. That being said, By war's end, the RCN's total score for U-boats sunk stood at 28 and the RCAF's at 27. The Battle of Britain could only be fought by those who were actually trained, equipped, organized, and ready to fight there in the summer of 1940. These were Churchill's few. Damn few, he might have added. Britain had to make do with the resources she had in being. It's an odd fact that on the day war was declared, there were more Canadians serving as commissioned officers in the RAF than the total number of officers in the RCAF. 3 in every 100 RAF officers were Canadian. One RCAF fighter-equipped unit did make it over in time, though. Number 1 Squadron landed in England in June, just after the fall of France, and 3 weeks before Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring launched his air fleets against Great Britain. 2 years would pass before the authorities recognized the work of the ground crews who toiled from well before dawn until late at night, every night, to ensure that Number 1 Squadron's Hurricanes were serviceable, fueled, and armed. The senior maintenance NCOs of A and B flights were singled out. Flight Sergeant C.M. Gale was mentioned in dispatches, and Flight Sergeant S.R. Birdies received the British Empire Medal. They were the first of many maintainers to be so recognized for their vital work. As well as Number 1 Squadron, Number 242 Canadian Squadron of the RAF under Squadron Leader Douglas Bader and other Canadians scattered throughout fighter, bomber, and coastal commands were Canada's contribution to that crucial battle. Before it was won, at the end of October, 47 Canadian pilots and aircrew had lost their lives. 242 Squadron went into action on the first day of the battle and scored victories. Number 1 was held back for more operational training, a lesson learned from committing green pilots too soon to combat flying in the First World War. But the Canadians were soon thrown into the fray. Number 1's score for the battle was 29 German aircraft shot down, as against 15 Hurricanes lost and 2 pilots killed. Some of the pilots who managed to bail out suffered horrible burns. Perhaps the most remarkable day for Number 1 Squadron was September the 27th. Between 9 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, the squadron's 13 pilots sortied 3 times. They engaged 70 enemy aircraft and destroyed 7 against no losses to themselves. There were individual highlights too. Pilot Officer J.E.P. Larichelière of Montreal, for example, scored 6 confirmed victories in just 2 days. It was a desperate time for these remarkably young and enormously brave pilots. Number 2 Squadron, RCAF, arrived at the end of 1940 and became 402. Within months, the RCAF in Britain grew to 17 fully formed and operational squadrons. But all was not well. By the end of 1941, the Canadians were credited with just 22 confirmed kills for all 5 fighter squadrons. 401 and 402 had been re-equipped with Mark IIB Hurricanes. 403 got the spectacular new Mark V-B Spitfires. But 18 months of cross-channel sorties had been less than productive. The older, more experienced Luftwaffe pilots in their Messerschmitt 109Fs proved more than a match for them, outperforming the Hurries and at least equaling the Spits. To make matters worse, late in 1941, the new and lethal Focke-Wulf 190 made its debut. It was superior at that time to any Allied fighter. As one pilot pointed out, the Spit could outturn a 190, but one couldn't keep turning all afternoon. RAF and RCAF losses became embarrassingly and unsustainably high. 6 Canadian fighter squadrons were in action by 1942. One of them suffered perhaps the worst day of the war for any Canadian fighter squadron on the 2nd of June that year. 403 Squadron sortied out on a sweep of France, part of a formation of several RAF units. They were bounced by a swarm of German fighters. 7 of the 11 Spitfires were shot down. In July, both 401 and 402 were re-equipped with Mark 9 Spitfires. At last, the Canadians had a machine that could stand and fight it out with the dreaded Focke-Wulfs. Unfortunately, their first major operation was in support of the Dieppe raid on the 19th of August. It was a disaster for Canadian flyers as well as Canadian soldiers. More than 100 Allied aircraft were destroyed that day, the heaviest air losses of any day of the war. The RCAF lost 13 aircraft and 10 pilots. In the meantime, Buzz Burling had been making a name for himself with the RAF in Malta. He was a natural pilot and a superb shot. With 32 confirmed kills by the end of the war, he was Canada's top-scoring ace.
It showed that Canadian pilots were up to scratch. One of the problems with the use of fighter aircraft was that throughout 1941-42, they were used on offensive sweeps over occupied France and Low Countries. And these offensive sweeps didn't achieve very much. In my view, they were a mistaken policy at the time, and they resulted in my view, unnecessary casualties to some of our better pilots. Where our pilots really shone was in night interception, and our night interception squadrons, as early as 1942, I think were among the best.
In April 1943, the man who became the RAF's top-scoring flyer with 38 enemy aircraft to his credit, Wing Commander Johnny Johnson, took over the Canadian wing and led it to a string of spectacular successes. That month, 11 Wing racked up 17 kills for only 3 losses. May and June were equally successful. By the end of 1943, RCAF fighter squadrons were able to claim a total of 135 victories. In the meantime, 4 night fighter and intruder squadrons had been formed as early as 1941, flying Douglas Bostons and Havocs and de Havilland Mosquitoes. Sweeping out across the North Sea and over occupied Europe, they conducted bombing, strike, and night fighter missions. In 1944, 418 Squadron downed 103 enemy aircraft, making it the most successful RCAF fighter squadron of the war. 2 Army Cooperation or Reconnaissance Squadrons were formed in 1941, and a third the following year. They flew Curtiss Tomahawks. These aircraft weren't really up to facing the enemy's machines, and the units saw little action until 1942, when the first North American Mustangs began to arrive. In the spring of '44, prior to D-Day, 3 new fighter squadrons were formed around the best, most experienced of the Canadian pilots. After the invasion and all through the summer, losses were light and successes many. The frighteningly powerful Napier-engined Hawker Typhoon was in service now, and flown by 438, 439, and 440 squadrons. Its 20mm cannons and rack-mounted rockets made it a formidable ground attack weapon. And it was used widely in this role, especially in 2-ship Rangers and rhubarbs. 418 Squadron, in their Mosquito 6s, made a specialty of intercepting and downing V-1 buzz bombs, either by gunfire or by flying alongside them and flipping them over with their wingtips. This stopped when the pilots heard that the Germans were putting detonators on the V-1's stubby wings. 418 bagged 68 of them. 2 reconnaissance units were organized early in the war for RAF Coastal Command using consolidated Catalinas, and later the stately Short Sunderland flying boats. 2 Canadian Sunderland squadrons, 422 and 423, were based first in Islay in the Inner Hebrides and later in Northern Ireland at Castle Archdale on Lough Erne. They served from 1942 on, flying anti-submarine patrols over the western approaches. Eventually, 6 RCAF squadrons were formed within Coastal Command and shared in the destruction of 9 U-boats in the eastern Atlantic. Large numbers of Canadian aircrew flew with RAF Coastal Command squadrons. RCAF 162 Squadron operated from Iceland under RAF control. In a 3-month period, it sank 5 U-boats, one of them through the gallantry of Flight Lieutenant D.E. Hornell, who was awarded a posthumous VC for the action. In June of 1944, Hornell spotted a U-boat on the surface somewhere off the Shetland Islands. He depth-charged the submarine and sank it, but not before its anti-aircraft gun had scored crippling hits on his Canadian-built Consolidated Canso flying boat. Hornell managed to land the flying boat in heavy seas. After abandoning the aircraft, he organized his crew to take turns in their only remaining dinghy. By the time they were rescued, Hornell was exhausted and blind. He died not long after being picked up. Canadians also served in the air in Far Eastern theaters. Among many heroes, one stands out in particular. Flight Lieutenant Burchill became the savior of Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka, when he spotted a Japanese task force en route for the island from his Consolidated Catalina flying boat. Before he was shot down and made a prisoner of war, he managed to get off a radio message which allowed the island's forces to organize a defense, which in the end saved the day.
Maximum effort tonight, 434, Germany. Target.
The first RCAF bomber squadron, 405 Squadron, was formed in April 1941. It carried the first RCAF attack into Germany by striking at the marshalling yards at Schwerte near Dortmund. Just 3 twin-engine bombers dropped a total of 11,000 pounds of high explosives and incendiaries, about 5,000 kilos, puny in comparison to payloads dropped later in the war. By the end of the year, 4 Canadian bomber squadrons were based in England, spread among 3 different bomber groups of RAF Bomber Command. On the night of May the 30th, 1942, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, Bomber Harris, launched the first 1,000-bomber raid into Germany.
The Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everybody else and nobody was going to bomb them.
68 of them were Canadian. The target was Cologne. By late 1942, most squadrons, including the French-Canadian 425 Squadron, had begun converting from the twin-engine Vickers-Wellington to the formidable 4-engined Handley-Page Halifax Mark II. On New Year's Day, 1943, the famous No. 6 RCAF Bomber Group was created as a purely Canadian group.
The formation of 6 Group was the success, eventually, of getting at least partial Canadianization of the RCAF overseas.
An enormous proportion of our pilots flew with 4 Group, for instance, flying Halifaxes rather than 6 Group. An enormous proportion of our pilots flew with British squadrons elsewhere. And by the end of the war, we still hadn't solved that Canadianization problem.
The RAF handed over 7 flying stations dotted around the hills and dales of Yorkshire in northern England. By March, it had 9 squadrons flying Halifaxes and Avro Lancasters. Commanded first by Air Vice Marshal G.E. Brooks, and later by the First World War fighter ace Air Vice Marshal C.M. McEwen, 6 Group eventually included 14 squadrons of heavy bombers. 405 Squadron was detached to form part of the Pathfinder Force, but kept its Canadian identity. It was led by one of Canada's renowned wartime flyers, Wing Commander Johnny Fauquier. The group's first missions were against the submarine pens at Lorient in occupied France. There was public pressure for strikes against these heavily reinforced installations, even though the RAF would have preferred to hit the Hamburg shipyards where the U-boats were being built. The bombers went over on 5 nights in January, sometimes flying through the dirtiest weather. Of course, even after some 2,000 bombers had dropped their loads on Lorient and flattened the town itself, the pens remained intact and the U-boats continued to sail to and from them. In March, a massive combined Anglo-American bomber offensive was given the go-ahead at the Casablanca Conference. This allowed the Allied air forces to set aside morale breaking in favor of a wholesale destruction of Germany's war industries. It was designed as a year-long softening up in advance of an invasion of Europe.
Strategic bombing was an inevitable policy in the Second World War. Long-range bombing on targets of great strategic importance were thought to be things that would have a very strong impact on the outcome of operations and on the war. But Bomber Harris had been working between the wars on the use of bombing aircraft in the Middle East in colonial operations, and he was convinced of the value of strategic bombing as a doctrine. Trenchard, between the wars, had been pushing the idea of strategic bombing as the role of the Air Force, as the means of winning a war. This was a war-winning device. So it was almost inevitable that the High Command of the Air Force would push for strategic bombing. And Churchill grabbed onto it as a means of carrying the offensive to the enemy when there was no other means of doing so. Whether strategic bombing was the correct policy is another question altogether.
Bombing did become more accurate, thanks to the Pathfinder's target marking techniques and better radar. In effect, these advances allowed all-weather flying and blind bombing. 6 Group flew missions against the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley and against cities such as Essen, Stuttgart, Wilhelmshaven, Hamburg, Mainz, and Berlin, Turin in northern Italy, and Caen in the south of France, to mention but a few.
Peenemünde is on the edge of the map up there. Here on the blackboard, you will see the large sketch.
They struck at the V-weapon sites at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast, losing 10 bombers on the way home to night fighters, and raided logistical and communications centers on the eve of D-Day. In July and August, the city of Hamburg was just about obliterated by successive Allied raids. The use of window gave the bombers a big edge against the German defenders. Like today's chaff, window was simply metallized strips of paper that, when dropped from the bombers, cluttered the radar screens of German ground controllers and seemed to fill the air with echoed images. Which ones were the real bombers? On each raid, the heavies dropped their bombs on the still-burning fires of the previous night's raid. Columns of smoke rose 4 miles into the air. Allied casualties were light. Destruction of the target was near total. Secret German estimates tried to describe the indescribable.
The overheated air stormed through the streets with immense force, taking along not only sparks, but burning timbers and beams, so spreading the fire farther and farther, developing in a short time into a fire typhoon such as was never before witnessed, against which every human resistance was useless. But
it didn't all go the bombers' way. In the winter of 1943-44, the Battle of Berlin was waged, involving repeated nightly raids against the capital. Distance, bad weather, and increasingly sophisticated defensive tactics resulted in only qualified success. Certainly, the damage done to the city was nothing compared to Hamburg. At the same time, 600 RAF and RCAF bombers were lost. The Germans exacted a measure of revenge for Hamburg on the night of July 28th. On a raid over the docks which were under reconstruction, the Canadian group contributed more than 200 aircraft and lost 22 of them to flak and fighters, their heaviest losses in the whole war.
It was a very grim experience. There is no doubt that you had to adopt a fatalistic view in order to go out night after night. And if you completed your tour of 32 operations, you were a very lucky person or a very skillful pilot or in a crew with a very skillful pilot. I've talked to a number of these pilots, and certainly the skill of the pilot had a great deal to do with the survival rate of that crew. Ground crews are the unsung heroes. One of the things that Johnny Folke used to emphasize when he talked about Canadian airmen's accomplishments in the Second World War, he was, of course, was the great Pathfinder leader, was that the ground crew had been ignored and they should be getting much better recognition than they did. There's a very close relationship between ground crew and air crew, and that relationship was very important to the success of the air crew. You know that the air crew couldn't possibly have operated without a very effective and competent ground crew.
6 Group was the single strongest element in Bomber Command, which itself was the most powerful force in the history of military aviation. In August 1944, a brilliant Canadian pilot, Squadron Leader Ian Bazalgette, DFC, was part of a Pathfinder force for a big daylight raid against the V-1 flying bomb launch site at Trossy-Saint-Maxime. After the master bomber and the deputy took direct hits, Bazalgette assumed command and flew his Lancaster towards the target. His plane was hit repeatedly by the murderous flak that came up. Both starboard engines and part of the fuselage were soon on fire, and several crew members wounded. Bazalgette ignored the flak and pressed home his attack, but the bomber was badly damaged. He gave the order to bail out. 2 of the crew were too badly injured to jump. With the Lanc still at 1,000 feet, Bazalgette could have jumped and saved himself, but he chose to stay with the plane and attempt a crash landing. But on his final approach, the village of Senant suddenly appeared directly in his path. Villagers could only watch as the burning Lancaster plunged towards them. At the last possible second, Bazalgette pulled the bomber up and away from their homes and put the plane down in a textbook wheels-up landing in a nearby field. But the aircraft exploded. His remains were taken from the wreckage by the villagers and hidden from the occupying German forces. He was buried later in the village graveyard. His mother received his VC from the King at Buckingham Palace that following December. The biggest RCAF raid of the war took place on the 6th of October, 1944, when German resistance in the air had been much reduced. Nearly 300 bombers raided Dortmund in daylight, with the loss of only 2 aircraft. In fact, 6 Group suffered the smallest percentage of losses of any Allied bomber group in the war, while flying the highest number of sorties. Fierce fighting continued through the Allied breakout at Caen, the closing of the Falaise Gap and the destruction of the German 7th Army, the pursuit through the Scheldt, the battle at Arnhem, and the liberation of Holland. And the perfectly timed but failed German counteroffensive in the Ardennes forest in December. It was during these missions that the bombers resumed their original role of ground support, really a form of aerial artillery. In the month of the invasion, pilot officer Andrew Charles Minarski earned his Victoria Cross. Again, it was a posthumous award. The air gunner stayed in a burning Lancaster after the rest of the crew had bailed out, trying desperately to save a trapped comrade. Eventually, Mynarski bailed out too, but he left it too late. His flight suit was already ablaze. French civilians watched him descend on fire. He died quite soon after reaching the ground. Almost unbelievably, the trapped rear gunner survived the crash of the Lancaster. It was he who told of Mynarski's bravery. 428 was the first squadron to go home. Bomber Harris saluted them as they took off. 215,000 Canadians served in the RCAF during the war, including more than 17,000 women. 95,000 went overseas to Britain and Europe, Iceland and Ceylon, and all sorts of places in between. After the war, the RCAF was reduced to an establishment of just 16,000 and resumed its traditional peacetime activities: aerial photography and survey, transport, Arctic resupply, and search and rescue. But it was also a period of firsts for the Air Force, as wartime developments were tested and put into service. Rockcliffe's #1 photo establishment was probably the most modern air survey photographic laboratory in the post-war world. In 1946 alone, it photographed more than 400,000 square miles of Canadian territory and processed over 1 million prints. The RCAF took delivery of the first of an eventual 85 Vampires in January 1948. They entered service at the Central Flying School at Trenton, and the nimble little fighters were an instant hit with their pilots. Soon, a recruiting drive would boost enrollment. Existing air bases would be upgraded and new ones built. Jet aircraft would be designed and built in Canada. All this in response to increasing nervousness about the new Soviet threat. Canada joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949, committed to the joint effort to counter the forces of the Soviet Union. At the Winter Experimental Establishment, extremely valuable tests on cold weather operations were carried out for both the RCAF and the RAF. Indeed, this became another area of expertise, perhaps not surprisingly given the Canadian climate. 2 main locations were used: Watson Lake, which was cold, and Churchill, which was just as cold, but it was windy too. The first rotary wing aircraft went into service with the RCAF in 1947, initially with Sikorsky H-5s, and later with Bell H-13s. The Mid-Canada Line project, part of the Air Defense of North America, was the RCAF's first major helicopter operation. In 1954, 102 radar sites were strung across the north from BC to the Labrador coast. Building the system was a fantastic achievement. Several types of helicopters were used to transport material and equipment, all from 108 Communications Flight, the only all-chopper unit in the RCAF at the time. Conditions were tough. Search and rescue was also put on a more organized footing. The country was divided up into 5 SAR regions, and 34 aircraft were earmarked for primary rescue. Norsemen, Dakotas, Cansos, Lancasters, and helicopters formed a network right across the country and up into the Arctic. The system also included rescue specialists trained in survival. Para-rescue training was organized for RCAF medical personnel in 1951. It was the start of a system that would save tens of thousands of Canadians' lives. Enormous progress was made in the late 40s and 50s in polar navigation, another area where the RCAF gained worldwide recognition. Canadian navigators flew in United States Air Force B-29s from Edmonton and Alaskan bases, developing navigating procedures, testing radars, and completing invaluable mapping and charting projects over the high Arctic. But in the meantime, Canadian air and ground crews were again involved with the real thing in the Far East. In June 1950, the forces of Communist North Korea attacked South Korea, and Canada joined United Nations combined forces against this unprovoked aggression. Our main contribution was to the Korean airlift, which continued until the middle of 1954. RCAF North Stars flew between McChord Air Force Base near Tacoma, Washington, and Tokyo, using the northern route via Alaska and the Aleutians, or the southern way via Wake Island and Hawaii. 22 Canadian fighter pilots flew operationally in Korea on exchange with the USAF. Between them, they accounted for 9 MiG-15s confirmed, 2 probables, and 10 damaged. Flying Officer Ernie Glover was the RCAF's top gun. He was credited with 3 confirmed kills and received the first Distinguished Flying Cross awarded since the end of the Second World War. Squadron leader A.R. Mackenzie was shot down and taken prisoner just before Christmas in 1952. He was set free by Chinese authorities in Hong Kong almost exactly 2 years later. In May 1951, the RCAF began recruiting women for the first time since the war. But this time, women could serve in the Air Force itself, not in a separate women's division. The RCAF Blue Devils aerobatic team was formed using vampires from 410 Squadron at Saint-Hubert. They performed at many air shows in Canada and the US between 1949 and 1951. They were instant hits. At about this time, Air Force Headquarters ordered the development of an all-Canadian, all-weather long-range jet interceptor for the air defense role. This would eventually become the Avro Canada CF-100. After a difficult flight test program, the CF-100 entered service with No. 3 Operational Training Unit in North Bay in late 1952. In 1950, the government decided that Canada would provide an air division to our forces in Europe. 4 wings of 3 squadrons each flying the latest fighter, the F-86 Sabre jet. The first Sabres went to 410 Squadron in May 1951. By early summer of the following year, 3 Canadian Sabre squadrons were in England flying as part of RAF Fighter Command, the first swept-wing fighters to fly with the RAF.
In the 50s, our Air Force had a very clear mission. We had a very high reputation for the competence of our air crew in Europe. We were a founding member of NATO, and the equipment we had was first-rate. So it was a period in which the Air Force really felt that it was carrying out a really important national role. Certainly, the RCAF was regarded very highly by its allied air forces in NATO in the 50s.
Fighter Group pulled off some impressive mass Atlantic crossings in this period. Whole wings of Sabres leapfrogged from Uplands and Saint-Hubert through Goose Bay, Keflavik, and Prestwick, landing at temporary bases at Grotonken in France, or Zweibrücken and Baden-Sollingen in Germany.
We were 63 Sabres in all, led by 3 DFCs, Edwards, McKay, Middlemans. On October the 1st, we took off from Goose in sections of 4, with the sections 5 minutes apart. It was an exhilarating time. We were mostly just sprogs, and there we were, heading out over the ocean in single-engine fighters, heading for Greenland.
Finally, late in 1954, the division came together at Marville in France and began receiving the new Orenda-powered Mark Vs in their warlike camouflage paint scheme. They were faster and could fly much higher than the Mark IIs, up to 50,000 feet. Not long afterwards, an important naval aviation milestone was reached. In October 1956, the first Canadian-built anti-submarine aircraft rolled out of de Havilland's in Toronto. This was the new Tracker, CS-2F, built under license from Grumman. With the introduction of Banshee fighters for air defense and the Canadian modified Trackers, along with an experimental unit of 6 helicopters for ASW, the Naval Air Branch seemed to be ready to take its place within one of the most capable small navies in the world. On the 17th of January, 1957, The powerful, renamed HMCS Bonaventure was commissioned in Belfast under the cranes of her builders, Harland and Wolff. By October, final modifications had been made and flying operations commenced. They would continue for 13 years. The Sabre jet seemed to symbolize the golden years of the RCAF through the 50s and into the 60s. Certainly, the Golden Hawks formation flying team displayed the necessary élan. Formed to commemorate the 50th anniversary of powered flight in Canada, they flew 65 shows through the summer of 1959. They were good. Newspapers called them the best in North America. Whenever our Sabres were in the air, incursion flights into NATO territory were recalled or postponed. The Soviets knew the MiG was inferior, and as for the cocky Canadians, they were sure they outmatched the Soviets in fighting spirit. It was not a universally joyful development when Ottawa decreed in 1956 that one squadron of each wing in Europe would have to give up their Sabres and re-equip with CF-100s to give NATO a frontline all-weather interceptor. Maritime patrol and anti-submarine warfare flying was re-established at Greenwood in the early 50s. Avro and de Havilland modified scores of Lancasters for the task. The RCAF took delivery of 25 Lockheed Neptunes in 1955. This was a well-proven aircraft, bought as a stopgap between the Lancasters and the Argus, which was still on the drawing board. 405 Squadron re-equipped with the superb Argus in May 1958. This much-altered Bristol Britannia airframe was converted by Canadair into a preeminent ASW maritime patrol aircraft. It was refined further into the elegant and stately CC-106 Yukon long-range transport, which started to replace the aging North Star in 1959. NORAD, North American Air Defense Command, came into being in 1958. Data from the Defense Early Warning Line, the Mid-Canada Line, and the Pine Tree Line radar stations were fed into underground headquarters in Colorado Springs and regional stations such as North Bay.
NORAD, the North American Air Defense Agreement, was designed to provide air defense against Soviet attack against North America over the pole. It meant very large American presence on Canadian soil and the presence of fighter aircraft capable of intercepting enemy aircraft working in very close association with the United States Air Force. NORAD had a profound effect on the employment of the RCAF. It meant we were tied in absolutely like that with the United States Air Force. Our doctrine was the same, our attitudes were the same towards air fighting. And it meant that we developed a very competent, more than competent, ability to carry out air interception. This was what a fighter pilot dreams of.
In 1953, Air Force Headquarters planners realized that the CF-100 would need to be replaced within a very few years. A dialogue ensued with Avro in Toronto, and in a short time, some refined performance specifications for an all-weather interceptor were released. They outlined a vision of a dramatically beautiful and aerodynamic swept-wing supersonic fighter that would outfly anything in the world. It took Avro under 2 years to go from first drawings to rollout of the prototype. March 1958. Test pilot Jan Zurakowski runs up the powerful Pratt & Whitney J-75s and takes aircraft number 25201 into the air. 9 months of test flights ensued. It became obvious very quickly that this was a very impressive aircraft. But, as everyone knows, on February the 20th, 1959, the Conservative government of John Diefenbaker canceled the program. Orenda's Iroquois engine was also canceled.
My personal opinion is that the government had no choice but to cancel the Aero project I feel that it had gone too far by the time the government decided to cancel it. It was extremely expensive, far more expensive than the Canadian government could afford, and all we were talking about was the airframe. We hadn't even talked about the what went into the airframe, and that would have been another very expensive load. So I think it was a prudent decision by the government at the time, unpopular and very hurtful to the Canadian aviation industry, no question about it. But we got into something that was over our head, in my view. Why they cut up the final airframes is something that nobody has been able to answer. One can speculate. My own personal speculation is that the Prime Minister wanted no sign of this remaining to perhaps tempt future people to rejuvenate the project.
2 years after the Arrow was cancelled and the existing prototype airframes scrapped, the government ordered 56 American surplus F-101Bs, later supplemented by 10 101Fs. This was the Voodoo tandem two-seat all-weather interceptor. By May 1962, the Voodoo had replaced the last NORAD CF-100 squadron, number 413, at Bagotville. The Voodoo's role as a high-altitude interceptor was based on the idea that its twin Pratt & Whitney J-57 turbojets would get it to its operational height very quickly. It had a climb rate of 36,500 feet a minute. In the early 70s, several squadrons were disbanded as the concept of détente between NATO and Soviet-led forces came into vogue. USAF operation of the two-seat Voodoo in first-line service terminated in 1971. Canadian first-line use of the type ended in 1985, another possible example of the outstanding work of Canadian maintainers. By the early 60s, a replacement was needed for the Sabres in the strike interceptor role. Canada would buy 239 Lockheed CF-104G starfighters. They would be built in Montreal by Canadair, who went on to produce them for other countries as well. In January 1962, the first 104 was delivered to Cold Lake. Over its career with the RCAF and with other air forces, the starfighter gained a reputation as a widowmaker, perhaps understandably. More than half of them crashed. With its single J-79 engine, the starfighter was more like a missile with a man in it than a plane. Its stubby wings were about the same size as its vertical fin. The dead stick landing speed was 240 knots. Its performance was pretty impressive for a multi-role all-weather fighter. With a top speed of around 1,150 miles per hour, the aircraft was versatile enough to be used in the ground attack role by the RCAF, really our main contribution to NATO for over 2 decades.
The big thing about the Cuban Missile Crisis is what it shows about the civilian-military relationship in Canadian defense policy. And it's quite clear that members of the Canadian cabinet during the Cuban crisis did not understand what their agreements with the United States implied for them. Consequently, they made delays that harmed our relationships within the military alliance and weakened our credibility with our allies and made the job of the RCAF in subsequent years, cooperating with the United States Air Force, much more difficult than it had been in the past.
A series of further political developments at this time cued the beginning of the end of our European role, a role which would from this point steadily diminish. Then came unification. It was introduced by Prime Minister Pearson's Defense Minister, Paul Hellyer.
The unification of the armed forces took place not long after the Cuban crisis and after the great problems of civil-military relations that were revealed under the Diefenbaker government. What he did was very damaging to immediate morale in the forces, and certainly led to a great deal of turmoil, and no one really knew what was happening for a long while. In Canadian Armed Forces policy, integration was a good thing in the eyes of the military. Unification among many of them was too much, too fast.
Of course, by the time unification was being implemented in 1968, the hoped-for savings were never realized in the way Hellyer had intended.
My feeling is that 12 years into it, things had settled down, and the biggest problem in the forces was not organization, but again, money for equipment so that we could meet our commitments. And this has been the problem ever since. Mr. Trudeau's approach to defense policy and to NATO was very closely allied to his view of Canadian national aims and objectives, and he was not enthusiastic about any military activity at all.
The early to mid-60s were also one of these intensive disposal periods when several of the fleets reached the end of their life cycles. Consolidated Cansos, Albatrosses, Flying Boxcars, Otters, Neptunes, Harvards, North Stars, our two de Havilland Comets, and Lancasters, all gone. The last of the magnificent Sabres flew in '67. The Golden Centenaires were formed for the national celebration. The team crisscrossed the country in their blue and gold Tudors, delighting crowds everywhere. The Red Knight was a crowd pleaser too. Starting in 1958, this spectacular red-painted T-Bird flew solo aerobatic demonstrations at air shows and other events until 1970. 17 pilots performed the role, 3 of whom were killed. In the mid-60s, a host of new aircraft began to arrive. The de Havilland Caribou, and later the Buffalo, the Cosmopolitan, the Hercules, the RCN Sikorsky Sea Kings, and the Army's Voyageurs. The Canadair CL-41 Tudor, Canada's first homegrown jet trainer, and the Dassault Falcon jets. 115 Northrop F-5A Freedom Fighters were ordered in 1966 to replace the RCAF's Starfighters, along with 46 two-seaters, designated the CF-5D. Powered by 2 General Electric J85 engines, boosted with afterburner to 4,000 pounds of thrust each, the F-5A was an attempt by Northrop to reverse the upward complexity cost spiral in single-seater fighter design. Even when the aircraft were delivered 3 years later, the CF-104s weren't replaced at all. 2 new squadrons were formed instead, and the Starfighters kept on flying. On the 20th of September 1969, while in the midst of intensive NATO exercises in the North Sea, the crew of the Bonaventure found out via CBC radio shortwave that their ship was to be scrapped. Some important helicopter and transport aircraft purchases were made, however. 5 Boeing 707s were bought to replace the Yukons in '71. 2 of these were later converted to tankers. The last of the Sikorsky H-34s were retired in '71 from Cold Lake, and 50 Bell CH-135s were ordered to replace them. The twin Huey and its power plant would turn out to be a major success story for the Canadian Forces and for its manufacturers. At about the same time, 74 Bell Kiowas were ordered. These light helicopters would be used for tasks like air observation, forward air control, and transport. Heavy helicopters arrived in 1974 with the Boeing Vertol CH-47 Chinook. More than twice as big as the Labrador, the Chinook had been battle-proven in Vietnam. peacekeeping UN operations continued. Based near Port Said on the Suez Canal, 116 Air Transport Unit flew about 150 hours a month in the challenging desert conditions. The re-establishment of a dedicated air command in 1975 would be the first of a series of steps that would emphasize a mission-capable force with a renewed sense of purpose. With the formation of Air Command in 1975, the Air Force regained its sense of purpose and unity. All military air services would come under a single entity again, as an Air Force, in fact. It had a total of 897 aircraft of all types in its inventory, everything from Musketeers to Boeing 707s and Sea Kings. More than 300,000 hours were flown by Canadian Forces aircraft that year. In 1975, the CF-5s were committed to the protection of NATO's northwestern flank, Norway. To help achieve this, a third squadron, 419, was formed. A very useful development was the in-flight refueling system developed by Beech Aircraft. A CC-137 fitted with the probe and drogue system gave the notoriously short-legged fighter a fast transatlantic capability. No sooner had the Arrow been cancelled and the Voodoos, Starfighters, and CF-5s ordered in its place than planning began to replace almost all of them with a new advanced fighter. In April 1981, the first CF-18 was handed over to the CF at a ceremony at Uplands. Designed to carry Sparrows and Sidewinders, a 20mm M61 six-barrel rotary cannon, and up to 17,000 pounds of ordnance, it was a formidable dual-purpose aircraft, well suited to Canada's unique flying conditions and operational roles.
It's rather like the situation between the two world wars when we acquired Siskins, so that we would keep the capability, whatever the threat, which is unknown. You can't forecast what aircraft are going to be used for. You have to have an aircraft that is adaptable to various kinds of roles to meet the unexpected crises that are thrust upon them. And yes, I feel that it's necessary to have a multi-role aircraft, particularly in times of uncertainty when you don't know what the future is going to hold.
Female candidates selected for pilot training arrived at Portage-la Prairie in November 1979. All three went on to Moose Jaw and qualified on the Tutor, the first women to become military jet pilots in Canada. Search and rescue is always a 24/7 job. SAR became better organized in the 70s and 80s, and SARTECs and air crews enhanced their already glowing reputations for performing rescue missions with bravery and skill. Through the years, transport squadrons such as 436 and 437, based at Trenton, have performed innumerable humanitarian relief missions and resupplied Canadian and UN operations in various inhospitable parts of the world. The first of 18 brand-new CP-140 Auroras, Canadianized versions of the Lockheed P-3 Orion Maritime Patrol aircraft, arrived at Greenwood, and 405 and 407 squadrons began to convert over from the Argus. It was the latest in a long line of post-war MPAs, starting with the ubiquitous Lancasters. 26 Arguses were consigned to the scrapyard, though several were saved for the museums, each aircraft having flown more than 15,000 hours, including the prototype. The CF-100 finally reached the end of its service life in 1981. While the airframe could have carried on indefinitely, Orenda no longer had the capability of rebuilding the engines. They were all flown to their very last hours. The Voodoos began to be ferried to Mountain View for disposal in 1982. The final flight of a starfighter in Canada occurred in October 1983, and in 1986, one Canadian Air Group's starfighters in Europe were replaced by CF-18s. It was a Thursday, the 2nd day of August 1990. The Iraqi forces of Saddam Hussein marched into Kuwait, the tiny but oil-rich Gulf state on Iraq's southern border. The Navy was called upon first. The task group's mission was clear: assist in deterring further Iraqi aggression by helping to impose economic sanctions. It arrived at Bahrain on September the 27th. Just a few days later, the ships embarked on their first operational patrol in the central area of the Arabian Gulf, monitoring and intercepting shipping inbound and outbound from Iraqi ports. By the end of hostilities, the task group had conducted nearly 1,900 interceptions and 22 boardings of suspect vessels. The night detection capabilities of the Sea Kings helped to account for this excellent record. Coincident with our ships arriving in the region, Canada sent a tactical fighter squadron to the Gulf to provide air cover. On October the 6th, the CF-18s of 409 Squadron took off from their base in Baden-Sollingen, Germany. A few hours later, they landed at a military airfield near Doha, the capital of Qatar, one of the small emirates on the western shore of the Gulf. This would be the Canadian Air Task Group's Middle East base for the duration of operations in the Gulf. The first combat air patrol was flown the next day, October the 7th. Tensions mounted through the fall. In mid-December, 409 Squadron handed over to 439 Squadron, which had flown out from Baden-Sollingen and departed for Germany. And a further 150 personnel from Cold Lake flew in via Bahrain to augment the Air Task Group. Early in January, the Chief of the Defense Staff ordered the deployment of 6 more CF-18s from 416 Lynx Squadron in Cold Lake to the Gulf, bringing the total number of fighters to 24 and creating the Desert Cats. At the same time, one of the CC-137 air tankers from 437 Squadron in Trenton was deployed. This allowed the fighters to increase their combat radius. It was also used to refuel Allied aircraft. Hostilities commenced early on the morning of January the 17th. Baghdad was hit hard by aircraft and Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from American battleships. Up to this point, the primary role of our fighters had been to conduct combat air patrols in the central Gulf, providing air cover to the Canadian Naval Task Group. But on January the 23rd, this role was expanded to include sweep and escort missions in support of other elements of Allied air forces. It was the first time Canadian combat aircraft had flown operations over enemy territory since the Korean conflict. The last major commitment of Canadian forces came on February the 20th in support of the final act. Canadian CF-18s would join the aircraft of 9 other coalition air forces in carrying out ground attack missions. Once again, Air Transport Group scheduled the long flights from Germany, this time airlifting bombs.
It soon became clear that flying combat air patrol over the ships was of limited value in that there had been very little sea-air cooperation training between the Navy and the Air Force, in spite of the fact that we were unified forces. And the results of that operation were indecisive.
The conflict in the former Yugoslavia also provided ample opportunities for the Air Force to contribute to operations. For example, between 1992 and 1995, when the Multinational Peace Implementation Force was established, the Air Force deployed 2 CP-140 maritime patrol aircraft to the Mediterranean. Based alongside the aircraft of other NATO partners in Sigonella in Sicily, the 405 Squadron Auroras helped to enforce UN embargoes imposed against the belligerents, flying up to 10-hour sorties over the Straits of Otranto and the Adriatic. And Hercules humanitarian relief flights were made into Sarajevo, many of them under combat conditions. After the stabilization force took over from IFOR, flights continued directly between Trenton and Zagreb, the capital of Croatia, using 437 Squadron's newly acquired Airbuses, designated the CC-150 Polaris. Other operations followed. Somalia in '93, and Africa during the operation to help repatriate Rwandan refugees from the eastern Congo in the winter of 1996. And Griffins from 430 Squadron have conducted a wide variety of operational duties in Haiti as part of our peacekeeping force there. Closer to home, practically every type of aircraft in the Air Force came to the aid of Winnipeggers and Manitobans during the Great Red River flood in the spring of 1997.
Of course, 1924 is not the birth of military aviation in Canada. Both military and civil aviation have been closely linked from the very beginning. That the foundations of air power in the country are not simply a military aviation force, but the entire infrastructure of aviation, the industry, the personnel, the aircraft, the techniques and so forth. There is something called air-mindedness, and that was built up in Canada, even between the wars and the depths of the Depression, so that we have attained a remarkable level of understanding of the use of the air in Canada. Our geography encourages it. As a result of our geography and of our geostrategic position in the world, we have a very strong influence in international civil aviation, which is closely linked to our role in military aviation. So I think that what the Air Force has to look upon as it reaches its 75th anniversary and looks forward to the next 75 years is that close relationship and the fact that they must keep in touch with the entire infrastructure of aviation in the country.
In an unpredictable world, it's difficult to say what the Canadian Air Force will look like in the future, what its role and purpose will be. But one thing is sure. Its men and women will continue to demonstrate that unique Canadian approach to any task. It's an approach that gets the job done, anytime, anywhere, whether it's beside a gravel airstrip in the high Arctic, a broken runway in Central Africa, or in the thick of it in trouble spots around the world. It's all part of our country's tradition of service in military aviation, a tradition that goes back a century, that protects all Canadians, that helps victims of war and catastrophe, and goes like an arrow through the hearts of all who fly, and all who love the miraculous fact of flight.